Well, welcome everybody and good evening. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman and welcome to Central Synagogue. It is our honor this evening to welcome Dr. Raquel Ukeles from the National Library of Israel. During our Israel at 75 celebrations, we've had all kinds of conversations and opportunities, and now is a moment for us to celebrate the cultural heritage of the State of Israel and the masterworks of the National Library. Dr. Ukeles is the head of collections at the National Library and formerly the curator of the Islam and Middle East collections. She is responsible for the overall development of all of the library's collections and for their digital, cultural, and educational initiatives based on the collections. Her doctorate is from Harvard University. She is a New York native and is an expert in Islamic and Jewish studies and relations. We are so thrilled to have you here. Thank you for coming back to New York for this.
My pleasure. I should use a mic because of Zoom.
Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and it's wonderful to be here. I moved to Israel in 2008, and now it's so fun to be back in New York, I have to say. So the title is Crossroads and Connections, and the truth is that the library, when you actually get into it, right? When you actually wander around, either physically or digitally, the library is a magical place. The library is a place of crossroads and connections, sometimes ones you look for, and sometimes serendipity takes over. And so I want to bring you into the world of the library. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this library and why we're here in New York, myself and my colleagues, because we're on the threshold of a brand new era that I want to tell you about because we're very excited about it. And then I want to do a deep dive into a number of our treasures because each one is a unique artifact in the world and has a phenomenal story. And so I'm going to tell you a few wonderful stories, and then at the end we'll have time for questions. Sound good? So I was always a user of libraries, right? As my kids say, Mommy went to school for a very long time. And I never spent a moment thinking about how a library is built or how it's constructed until I crossed the aisle. I was a liberal arts college professor in the States, and then my California husband said, enough of the Northeast, either we're moving to Jerusalem or we're gonna move to California. So we always say we made Aliyah because of the weather. And I loved being a liberal arts college professor, but when I came to Israel, I felt that there wasn't exactly that parallel. And I said goodbye to my formal academic career, and I entered into the world of libraries. I had this bug about having an impact because the library, being a place of crossroads and connections, very much sits on that bridge between the world of ideas and the broader world of society. And hopefully by the end, you'll see what I mean. Okay, so if I can figure this out, we will go forward. So I want to start more than 130 years ago. We're in the late 19th century. That's a period of tremendous fervent conversations going on all over the Jewish world, whether it's Eastern Europe, it's in Israel, Palestine, here in America. Jewish intellectuals were grappling with Jewish problems, and whether the problem was defined as persecution of Jews, of discrimination, of the tremendous disappointment in emancipation, and that it didn't lead to a new place of acceptance for Jews, or whether it was the other side of that coin, the fear of emancipation, of the loss of the control of the traditional community, secularism, and the feeling that Jews had lost Judaism. And so those are the two main concerns that Jews were chewing on and thinking about. Now, this conversation took place locally, but it also took place across locales in the technology of newspapers. Now, it turns out that Jewish newspapers did a tremendous amount to develop a sense of Jewish belonging beyond the local place, because through newspapers, a little bit like a proto-social media, allowed for conversations. I could be in Odessa and you could be in Jerusalem, and we could have a conversation through the newspaper. And by reading the same newspapers, we formed a kind of community of ideas. And in this community of ideas, the notions, the beginning of what becomes the Zionist movement start to percolate. And a part of this conversation in the direction of more about Judaism and Jewish culture, they started to develop an idea about a library. Now, why a library? It turns out that Jews, being people of the book, right, as the Quran says, Jews are people of the book, but historically Jews were not people of libraries. Now, I discovered this when I was writing the introduction to a beautiful new book, which hopefully you'll all buy, called 101 Treasures of the National Library. And we wrote about the history of the library. We went back and wrote about history of Jewish libraries. And it turns out there are very few. There are very few Jewish libraries throughout history, which is kind of shocking, right? You start to think about the Talmudic academies in ancient Babylonia, Sur and Pumbedita. They had no libraries. In fact, they had almost no books on the shelf. It was a completely oral culture. The Gaonic academies in Baghdad, they had archives, copies of letters they sent, but they didn't have libraries. In fact, you go from one Jewish center to another, and there were almost no collective libraries. No, Jews had books. Jews traded books. Jews had commissioned the copies of books, but I'm talking about manuscripts, of course, at this point. But we have very few examples of any kind of attempt to create a public collective institution. Now, Jews had institutions, but for some reason, the idea of placing your books in a collective place was one step beyond the infrastructure that Jews felt they either needed or were comfortable doing. Of course, there are episodes of primarily Christians burning Jewish books, right? Which probably just exacerbated this need to keep your books private. So the idea in the late 19th century, where Jews are thinking about how to solve these crises of Jews and Judaism, the first idea, the first institution was, let's build a library. And so that was a revolutionary idea. Now, in the 1860s, the idea first was thrown out, and there was a lot of debate about, questions that sometimes we grapple with. Who is a Jew, right? What's a Jewish book? What should be in this library? Should it be open on Saturday? Should it have secular material? Who gets to go to the library? And there were a number of attempts to build this library, and one by one they failed for various reasons. Often lack of resources, but also a lot of lack of a unified idea of what is this vision. Until 1892. And in 1892, our library finally opens, and it's a combination of Jewish intellectuals from Eastern Europe feeding books to Jerusalem. And they open 400 years exactly from the expulsion from Spain, and they call this library Midrash Abravanel or Abarbanel, depending on how you call the famous biblical commentator, who also was the leader of the Jewish community in Spain, making that terrible decision to take his community into exile in order to survive. You're jumping ahead here. You're ruining my story here. Because it starts as Midrash Barbanel. And then in 1896, along comes our hero, Dr. Yosef Chazanovich, who was a doctor from Bialystok, and he was the true hero of the story. Because Chazanovich took this idea and really ran with it. There needs to be one place that actually is the equivalent of what we call kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles, but in the book version. Because Jewish culture was produced all over the world, and Jewish texts reside all over the world. So if the goal is to revivify Jewish culture, then we need to bring all the great books of Jewish culture together. And so Chazanovich came to Palestine in 1896, and he looked at this library and he says, this one we have to build and build big. He went back home and he became a one-man missionary project. He wrote in all these newspapers I talked about, in which he describes what this great vision is, and then he started collecting books. Now, I've seen different numbers over the course of his lifetime, up to about 36,000 books that he collects and ships over to Jerusalem. Now, this library, Midrash HaBarba, now we're looking at a picture from early 20th century, becomes the collection, the combination of these other failed libraries, including one that was started by Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's called the founder of the modern Hebrew, who tried and failed, and Ginzei Yosef, which was the collection of Yosef Chazanovich, until we get to about 1919. In 1919, a new project of the cultural Zionists, and that is to build a university. And so they broke ground in 1919, and in 1925, they opened the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus, and they adopted this library and adapted it. They took the original vision of being a national Jewish library, and they added the dimension of being a university and universal library. And so for most of the library's history, it had these two roles: the national origins and a functioning university library, collecting according to the faculty. As the university expanded, so did the library. And what was different about this versus other university libraries in Israel is that it was open to the public. And it had a few very interesting projects that kind of synchronized between the research side and this national project. I'll talk about one a little later. So this continues, it continues into 1948. 1948, of course, the original building of the library becomes inaccessible because Mount Scopus becomes an island surrounded by Jordanian soldiers, and that we have these amazing photographs of the librarians Rapunzel style taking out books one by one before the Jordanian soldiers come. The library then has a decade where it moves around, mobile library in 10 different locations, until the university decides it's time to accept the reality and to build a new campus, and that's called Givrat Ram, which opens in 1958. And the Lady Davis building of the National Library, built smack in the middle of this original campus, opens in 1960. Modern, technologically advanced in 1960, a beautiful open building. And this continues until 1967, when, surprise, back to Mount Scopus. And then in the 70s, the university makes the tough decision and moves the humanities and social sciences to Mount Scopus, thereby separating this library from its immediate clientele. And starts a long decline of this library, where the library was kind of a department of the university. And so the university had budget surpluses, it was good. And when the university had budget shortfalls, the library was the last to receive. And the librarians of the time kept that library together despite everything, until the 1990s. And in the 90s, the university looks around. Here we are at the beginning of the digital era, the beginning of the internet, the first time we all got email addresses, right? And we started to have almost utopian fantasies of what was going to happen to humanity, right? Who needs buildings anymore? We're just going to plug something into our brains, right? So the university began a conversation with the government and other stakeholders about this library. Is it really the right decision for a national library to be part of a university? And so, like all good Jewish organizations, what do you do when you have a big question? You hire a consultant, and you create a committee. And so they did. And they brought the heads of the greatest libraries around the world together for an international committee led by retired Supreme Court Justice Yitzhak Samir. And then they had another local committee to try to decipher and figure out what to do about the findings of the international committee. And after a decade, they came to a decision. There's still a reason to build a physical library. But in order for it to be a real national library serving the public, it needs to leave campus, has to get out of the ivory tower, and it has to be reborn. And in this, again, towards the digital age, this idea, it had to be completely hybrid, physical and digital. And thus began what we call the renewal of the National Library, marked by, in 2007, the Knesset passes this law. Anyone who's heard a little bit about the news about the library recently and this weird hostile takeover problem that we had, which thank God we seem to have dodged that bullet, would understand how ironic it was, because this law passed with unanimous support across the political spectrum, and the Prime Minister being one of the greatest advocates. So that was good. And so here is the law. And for the first time, formalizing the mandate, the mission of the National Library as being of two kinds. And this is a library that's unique in the world. All national libraries are very much connected to nation-state building and national ideologies. This library, it was unique in its founding because it preceded the formal national movement. But now it is distinctive, we'll say, because it has two mandates. It is the National Library of a geographic nation, the State of Israel, and an ethnic nation, the Jewish people worldwide. And you see that at the end here. And the other piece of this, we look at this text almost like a Talmudic text. We sit and we study it, and we interpret each word. And in particular, we look at to collect and preserve. Well, that's what libraries traditionally did. But then you have these two new words, and that is to cultivate and to endow. And those two words, cultivate and endow, launched several new divisions at the National Library, which I want to tell you about. And that is to understand, what does it mean to be a national library in the 21st century? It is both to collect the cultural heritage of the nation, or in this case, two nations, or overlapping nations, and also to be very actively engaged with the public. It's not enough to just collect and wait for someone to come by. That we need to be much more proactive about getting out into the public. Now, we've been doing that for the last decade in Israel, and we've begun to do that all over the Jewish world, but it raises really interesting questions about, talk about Israel-diaspora relations. What does it mean to be the library of the Jewish people, the institution of the collective national memory of the Jewish people worldwide, in each and every Jewish location, right? It raises, and if you have ideas at the end, I'd love to hear them, because it's an ongoing question. So today we have 5 main collections. I'll mention them very quickly, and then I'll come back to them when we look at some of the treasures. We have examples in the middle. We have a beautifully illuminated manuscript from Spain from 1350 of the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, the Code of Jewish Law by Maimonides, a Judaica collection, which is our oldest collection and the largest and most diverse collection in the world today. We have on your left the archive of Hannah Senich, which I'll come back to, which was deposited at the National Library in the end of 2020, and that represents our Israel collection, and those are our 2 national collections. And then we have on the other side an example from our music collection. That's, does anyone know who that is? That's Nomi Shemer, and her archive is at the National Library, and we have the National Sound Archive and the world's largest collection of Jewish and Israeli music. And then we have 2 world-class research collections. One is our Islam and Middle East collection. It's a beautiful manuscript from the 14th century, written probably in Jerusalem, a Sufi poem, The Mantle of the Prophet. And we have writings of Isaac Newton, which was bequeathed to the library and represents our general humanities collection. Okay, so these 5 collections are kind of halfway point between certain libraries, national libraries in the world that only collect from their geographic nation versus the British Library or the Library of Congress that collects everything on earth. So we collect these 2 national circles, the regional circle of the Middle East, and throughout the world, those cultures that have been in conversation with the other collections. Okay, so for example, we collect on India because it provides the context for our Islamic material in India, or we collect Eastern Europe in conversation with our Jewish collection. Now, when we talk about collecting, as a library, we're interested in texts, okay? So text, we always say text as opposed to objects. Now, a book is an object, right? But what we mean is what we're interested in is the content, okay, the text. Now, text today we define as everything from manuscripts, books, newspapers, journals, archives, music, photographs, maps, and a whole array of digital materials, which opens up all sorts of interesting other questions, like archiving the Israeli and Jewish internet that we do. We have a lot of oral history materials, a lot of other audio materials like radio programs. So here are examples from our archives collection. We have 1,500 personal archives, and through our subsidiary, the Central Archive for the History of Jewish People, we have thousands of community archives around the world. So, anyone want to venture a guess? Wait, no, because you seem to know a lot. Let's try someone else. Kafka? Alice Shalvey? Sharansky, we all know. No, but this is a beautiful woman from Yemen, and it's a photograph of Frederick Brenner, who might be known to you, is a phenomenal photographer of Jewish communities around the world, and he has given us his archive of 100,000 frames, documenting Jewish life in places where the Jews aren't there anymore. And so these are just a few examples. Now I said, remember those words, collect and preserve, and then cultivate and endow, right? So I've talked a little bit about the collect and preserve side, which is ongoing work. Every day, every month, every year, we continue to build our collections. What do we do with them? So we talk about several different channels of activity. First and foremost, education. When we talk about education, we talk about physical programs. In the current building, which we're pretty limited, we have primarily programs related for teachers and students from Jerusalem. About 40% of our programs are actually in Arabic for East Jerusalem teachers and students. And COVID, of course, opened up new bizarre possibilities of accessing teachers and students all over Israel and beyond. And here are some of the educational outreach materials that just indicate different kinds of educational communities that we're reaching out to, Hebrew and Arabic in the ends, and then we've done a lot of work in Europe, and we're starting to work with educators here in America as well. We're moving into Russian, into French, into Spanish. Because again, what does it mean to be the library of the Jewish people? Education is the first. Culture is the next one, and that is we have a whole set of cultural programs, from lectures and conferences, but also musical programs, festivals, film festivals, holiday-related programming, online programming of NLI USA. Maybe this is an opportunity if you haven't met my colleague Adina Canfield, who's the head of NLI USA, who's our local representative. What? What does it mean, where's Salai? Okay. Salai Meridor is the chairman of our library. Okay. The third channel is digitalization. And like institutions all over the world, we have been digitizing. We've been digitizing material for a few decades now, and we have massive projects. Here is one of them. This is one of the most, to me, this is one of our greatest contributions to the Jewish people, and that is an archive of the historical Jewish press, which now has 4.5 million pages in over 20 languages, and it grows all the time. We have wonderful partnerships with New York institutions, New York Public Library, YIVO, Columbia, NYU, and then further, actually hundreds of institutions, both here in America and the world. And if you look very closely, you can see from Jewish Comment from 1918, we have here the new rabbi of the Central Synagogue. Because if you go on this website, you can find your family, you can find any subject you want, and it's used by literally hundreds of thousands of people and more. Now, when we talk about the Library of the Jewish People, here are a few examples of what we've done until now. Partnering with cultural institutions like the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, this was in Sun Valley, Idaho, just a month or two ago, doing work in all over the world, gathering materials, and working with library professionals in many different places around the world, like Italia, is to help Italian professionals catalog Italian Jewish books. Now, when we talk about the renewal of the library, we always talk in two directions, right? The physical and the digital, right? And so when I said to you that after this decade of committees, there was a decision the library needs to leave campus and be reborn, well, here we are, finally, after a long time, on the threshold of our beautiful new building. Now, if you look closely, you'll see the Knesset in the background, and this sits on that corner between the Knesset and the Israel Museum. And what's distinctive about this library is that it has no gates or walls. And it symbolizes the architects who are the Swiss architects Herzog and de Meuron, world famous architects, really, really phenomenal. In fact, not me, but my architecture friends say that there is no building in Israel that is being built at this level and is considered to be by far the most important cultural project in Israel today. And you see right away the values of openness, right, and access, which define our library today. So not just me, but CNN called it the #1 of the top 10 buildings that are going to change the architectural world in 2023. And so I'm going to do just a 2-minute tour of the building. We started to move in our books last year. We have moved all the books in the closed stacks and all the archives. So it's about 4.1 million books have moved over and millions of pages. But the first book we wanted to move, and here you see Kinze Yosef, right? And we chose a book from the Yosef Chazanovich original collection, our great hero and founder of the National Library. So his book went first when we moved the books. And so here we are at the entrance. There actually is 2 entrances. This is the main entrance from Kaplan Street. When you walk in, you immediately feel all the different uses and ways to experience the library. You go into the bookshop, make a left to the education wing, you go a little further to the auditorium, and on the right you have the reading rooms and the visitor center. So let's take a look. This is the cross-section of the building. It's 11 floors, 7 down and 4 up. And you can see that the reading room occupies the center. The architects talked about a kind of well of knowledge or spiraling through the entire building, and it starts from the skylight and goes all the way down. And here are the reading rooms. They're very, very beautiful, open, and they allow for many different ways to sit in a library, because today some people want to talk and some people want to be quiet, some people want to find a comfy chair, and some people want a desk. And so these 3 levels start from the most casual, and they get more and more serious as you go down. You start at the visitor center, or you go to the education center, which will be both for formal and informal programming. You go visit the permanent exhibition, where for the first time we'll be able to exhibit our treasures on a full-time basis. Attend a lecture or a conference or a cultural program in the auditorium, or you can come to a book festival or some kind of cultural festival outside. The library houses a synagogue. Today, in our current location, we have over 100 people attending prayer services, Jewish prayer services, and we also have a multi-faith prayer room, which will have a beautiful mihrab, because the primary use will be for our Muslim staff and readers, and I was involved in choosing the Armenian tiles that are going into the mihrab, and there's also a screen that can cover it if we have other groups who want to use the space for Christian prayer, for Zen meditation, for contemplation. When you go all the way down to the bottom of this spiral, you get to this room, which sometimes we joke and call the Holy of Holies. And it is our special collections reading room where you can see an original map, archival document, manuscript, musical notations. It's a very, very beautiful space, very much designed for the most serious and rigorous scholarship. So that's a little bit about the library, about the history of the library, and about where we're heading. With the rest of my time, I want to now do a deep dive into some of our treasures. So remember, we have these 5 main collections, and so I'm going to show you a few items from each collection, starting with the Judaica collections. Now, maybe some of you have heard about a certain item that's coming up for auction soon at Sotheby's called the Sasson Codex, right? Yes. So at the National Library, we have 11 codices. They are also called crowns, ktarim, and it actually is, the original usage was Arabic, meaning taj, and that was the term that has two meanings. One meaning is that it's a very beautifully illuminated Bible, a Tanakh or Torah, but there's a more technical term for the keter, and that is, unlike a scroll, a Sefer Torah, where you just have the words, right? I assume many of you, if not all of you, have seen the inside of a Torah. So there's no punctuation, there's certainly no cantillation notes, there's no vowels. And a keter has all of those things. So here is a 10th century codex written in the land of Israel. And you see right away 3 columns, right? And you can see, if you get in close, that all of the information that you would need that isn't in a Torah scroll is right here. The punctuation, the vowelization, the cantillation notes, the Tamei Mikra. And then you have running vertically, right? You have these notations, and then you have above and below other notations. What is that? That is called the Masorah. The short ones are called the little Masorah, and the longer ones are called the big Masorah. What is that? So you can say it's kind of the cliff notes. It's the very detailed information about how to write these words, how to write them on a page, and also how to pronounce them. Now, this information was gathered and developed over hundreds of years. Some say starting even as early as the 6th century, but very much in the 8th, 9th, 10th century. That this is scholarly activity that went on both in Babylonia and in the land of Israel. Both rabbinic Jews and Karaites were very much involved in this work. And there were a number of families that started producing these authoritative texts, right? Because until then, it had been oral. Remember, we talked about in the Babylonian and Talmud academies that the scholarship and the learning was completely oral. So we're in this interesting historical transition from oral to written, and it's no longer acceptable that all the knowledge is oral. It has to be written down. What's interesting is that at the beginning, the information was practical. But as you go through the ktarim, these codices, from the 10th century to they even go into the 15th century, the information becomes less practical and more decorative. And that's the beginning of micrography, which is the art of little words that form designs. And that's an inherently Jewish art form because of this purpose. And that is, you don't want to be the one to not copy this material, but the information is no longer needed because it's been learned and assimilated and accepted. Here's another example of a keter. Oh, this is the outside, forgot. It's a massive text, very, very heavy. So it means it was not designed for an individual, let's say, but for a community to have an authoritative guide of how to read the Torah. Now, why are these called Damascus crowns? They were written, I said this was written in the land of Israel. They were written all over the place. Some of them were actually written originally in Syria. Some were written in Spain, in Ashkenaz, in Germany, in Italy, but they all found their way to the Damascus Jewish community because the Damascus Jewish community venerated in particular these texts. Each synagogue in Damascus had one of these texts in the Aron Kodesh. They did not use it liturgically, but it was seen as giving bracha to the community. And that's why they're called the Damascus crowns. This is from 1260 Burgos in Spain, and this is considered to me the most beautifully illuminated ketel that there is. This is a page between the sections of the Tanakh, but you would see if I showed you another page, you would see that the Masorah, those cliff notes, have become very, very decorative. And here's a close-up. So we just talked about the early redaction and the writing down of the Torah. I want to move now to another version of the Torah, and this is called the Orit. The Orit is sometimes in English called an Octateuch, if you know the word Pentateuch, meaning the 5 books of Moses. So the Octateuch is 8, and that is the 5 books of Moses plus Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And those traditionally chronologically are considered to be the oldest extra books after the 5 books of Moses, and that makes up the sacred scripture of the Beit Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community. Now, the Orit is written in a Semitic language called Gez, and that is a language that is sacred for sacred scripture shared by Jews and Christians. And so in order to know whether a text is Jewish or Christian, you have to look at the contents. And this one is interesting because in addition to the Orit, it actually has in the beginning a biography of Moses, and it has a very interesting section about a group of Jewish monks in the Ethiopian community, which is not found in other communities, for another lecture. Here's a close-up. Gez is a Semitic language, but it's actually written left to right, like English, okay? And the red lines are ends of sections and chapter titles. This particular Orit was in the family of an Ethiopian community that lived in the Tigray region, which unfortunately was in the news recently. And it was in a family of what we would call a Kohen, Kes. The family was called Kes Yasso. And in the 1980s, the family makes the decision that they're going to Eretz Israel. They're going to the land of Israel, and they cross through deserts. And in Sudan, they were attacked by bandits and lost a lot of their belongings, but they were able to save this item. And they brought it to Israel. And then a few years later, they realized that this is such a precious treasure that it shouldn't be in the hands of a family, but it belongs in the library of the Jewish people. And so in 2016, they came to the National Library, and they came with 100 members of their family, and they came singing and dancing, and they came upstairs, and they opened the Orit, and they recited from it. And there was not a dry eye in the room. It was one of the most moving days in the library. And they came back every year or two until COVID, unfortunately. And hopefully in the new building, they will return to their custom. And so you see here, we've already talked about what does it mean to be the library of the Jewish people, the collections that are coming, each text having this extraordinary journey, whether it started in the land of Israel, it started in the Tigray region, and finding its way to Jerusalem. Incidentally, the 10th century Keter that I showed was part of the Sasson collection, the same collection of the Sasson Codex that was purchased by the library in 1978 when the Sasson collection was first sold. And it was a crowdfunding method that was started by Teddy Kollek, the mythical mayor of Jerusalem, that these treasures have to get to the National Library. And that's how there are 7 beautiful manuscripts from the original Sasson collection that made its way to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the Sasson Codex got away. Okay, a few examples from the Israel collection. This person might not be so famous as a face, but his anthem is one of the most famous Hebrew songs today. Okay, so it turns out that Naftali Hertz Imber wrote a 9-stanza poem called Tikvatenu, Our Hope, in the 1880s. And it was picked up almost immediately by early settlers, particularly in Rishon LeZion, and they immediately shortened it to 2 stanzas, and they put it to a Romanian folk tune, which is the tune we sing today. And this song becomes much more famous than this individual, than Naftali himself. He, it turns out, had a very troubled life. He had issues with alcoholism and became quite disheveled, so much so that when in the Zionist congresses they discussed the anthem and they sang his anthem, they didn't let him in. He ends up coming to New York City. He's hospitalized, we believe at Mount Sinai. And he's visited by a woman named Jeanette Robinson, who is a Jewish ethnomusicologist, and she asked him to write down the words of the only Hebrew song she knew. So he took a piece of hospital stationery and he wrote down the words. At the last minute, he tore off the top that had the name of the hospital because he thought that wasn't so dignified, and he gave it to her. He unfortunately died the next year in 1909. It was only in 1933 that the Zionist Congress formally ratified this as the Zionist anthem. There was competition. Bialik wrote a poem also, but this was by far the popular favorite. Now, if you notice here, the language is a little different, right? Lashuv la'eretz avotenu, right? La'ir bo David chana. Okay, the Zionist settlers later, they changed it because they felt that that sounded like the project was in the future and not that the project is underway. And so it turns out that this page is, as far as we know, the only surviving copy of Imber's autograph of Hatikva. And when she found afterwards that when it was ratified as a Zionist anthem, she decided, like the family of Case Isaac Yasso, that this item can't stay in private hands. It has to go to the Library of the Jewish People. And so she donated it the year later. I mentioned earlier the archive of Chana Senesh, and this is a gift that is underway from wonderful friends of the library who live now in Arizona, the Eisen family. And this is an archive that actually was in the hands of the family for many, many years, who took very good care of it. But they also came to understand the importance of having it in a public institution in the Israeli National Library. And so, wait, this is a picture from the archive. That's Chana, who 18-year-old Chana came to Palestine and joined the Nahalal Agricultural School. So this archive includes pictures of Chana and her brother and her family from a very early age. She was born in Budapest. Her father was a very well-known journalist and children's author, but he unfortunately died when Chana was 6. The whole family wrote, and in particular, Chana wrote from a very early age. She edited the family newspaper from the age of 6, and she was constantly writing. We have her diaries and her songbook. Here we're looking at her the book of songs, which she called Lelo Safa. Sorry, let me just add a few pieces if you don't know. So Chana was living in a time of greater and greater anti-Semitism, and she, as a teenager, becomes interested in Zionism, joins a Zionist youth group, and decides at the age of 18 she's going to immigrate, leaving her brother and mother, but her brother comes soon afterwards. In her diaries, which were start out in a Hungarian, we see a very intensely dedicated young woman to learning Hebrew, and she says she's gonna, from here on in, write only in Hebrew, and then she backtracks, because she doesn't have enough Hebrew, and then she tries again. But it's pretty astonishing what she was able to accomplish, not in her own language, from already before she moves to Eretz Israel, to Palestine, that she's writing poetry in Hebrew. And so here we see she calls herself Hagal, which was her code name when she becomes a paratrooper, but she calls it Lelo Safa because she was extraordinarily bright, which you can see from her diary and her thoughts, and she understood this tension of being between languages. And here we see the dedication to Miriam Yitzchak, who was her friend from Nahalal. And it says, my first and dearest reader and critic in true friendship, Chana. So Chana went to Nahalal, and then she joined the initial group to form Sdot Yam Kibbutz in Caesarea. And in her diary, you can see her slowly integrating into the life of the kibbutz, but feeling this great pull, this tension of what's happening back home, and her deep, deep fear of what's happening to her mother. And there's a moment in the diary which happens when the Nazis start to gather to invade Hungary, when she realizes that she can't live this pastoral kibbutz life anymore. She has to go back. And that's this decision of this budding intellectual, this poet who decides, no, I'm going to be a paratrooper. She goes down to Cairo to get trained as a paratrooper. She joins the Jewish Brigade, and then she goes to, in 1944, she goes back to Europe. She parachutes into Yugoslavia, crosses the border, and is very quickly captured. Earlier, we have this, from her diary, we have this song, which becomes the most famous song. I know I sang it around the campfire, Eli, Eli. And we have different versions of this song, and that's what's amazing about an archive. You can watch the process. This song was called Walking to Caesarea, which starts to get a little more context now that you know she was walking to Caesarea. And you can also see, is it here? Yeah. Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer le'olam, with the spelling mistake, right? As a new immigrant, I have great sympathy and empathy. And so this was a song that she's writing in her private material, and she didn't actually publish anything. It turns out that this poem, after she went off to Cairo and then she went to Europe, her fellow kibbutzniks and who were connected to the Zionist movement, they found some of her material, and they decided it would be good for morale if they publish, the young paratrooper, the hero paratrooper, and to publish her poem. And so her poem was actually published in a Zionist journal as she's paratrooping into Europe. But she wasn't known as a poet until after she died, and they came back to the kibbutz and found a suitcase under her bed. And there, all of her poetry was found. And then some was published, some was handed to the family. But she, unfortunately, never made it out of Hungary. She was arrested by the Hungarian police. She was interrogated and tortured. They even brought her mother to try to put pressure on her. And then she was executed in November 1944. They found afterwards in her pockets 2 notes. One note was her final poem, and one note was her letter, her final letter to her mother. And here it is. And the note says, "My dear mother, there's no more time for words. All I can say is I love you, my great love and a million kisses, and my terribly sorry. Your daughter, Chana." All of this material, as soon as the library got it, we immediately digitized it and made it openly accessible. Because the other part of to deposit material into the library of the Jewish people is our responsibility to cultivate and endow, and that is to make it available to the Jewish people and worldwide. Jumping now to more recent material from the Israel collection. This is one of my favorites. The photographer Dan Arnon. I don't know if has anyone ever heard of him. He has spent his life documenting each and every ritual in Israeli society. And they're phenomenal photographs. I'll just show you a few examples. Some of them are very recent. This was from last month. B'nai Brak conducting the affairs of selling chametz, and here's a non-Jew who turns out was a lawyer, and so he got very interested in the whole legal proceedings. And then we have, this is an earlier picture of Ramadan in Jerusalem. Ramadan, for the last few years, has overlapped with Pesach. And here is a very recent ceremony from Kfar Kana, which was the site in the New Testament of Jesus turning water to wine. And here are some beautiful pictures of the ritual that has been going on there for thousands of years. How are we doing on time? Maybe I'll just do one more, and then I'll open it up for questions. So you saw in the beginning Naomi Shemer, right? You were able to identify her her face, and of course, we have the iconic Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. Now, what's interesting about this song is that it turns out that this song was written in response to a contest and during the 60s and 70s, every Independence Day, they would have a song contest, and they would invite certain songwriters to come up with new songs. And so in 1967, for Yom Ha'atzmaut, they turned to 5 singers. Naomi Shemer was the youngest of them, and to write a song about Jerusalem. At first, she refused because she felt intimidated by the company she was being put in. But then she remembered the story about Rabbi Akiva giving his wife, Raquel, a piece of jewelry called Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, that it's a gold piece of jewelry of a stone from Jerusalem. And so she wrote a song of 3 stanzas. And then when the Six-Day War broke out, she was on the bus going down to the Sinai to sing for the troops like every other singer in the country. And she heard that the Israeli army had captured Old City of Jerusalem. And all she had with her was her little pocket diary. And so she took out the pocket diary and she very quickly wrote that 4th verse. We returned to the cisterns, to the cave, to the old stones of Jerusalem. And so here it is. And again, all this stuff is digitized. Do we have time for one more, or we're...
So if you take time for one more, that will give everybody here a chance to think about whether they have a question. We'll be able to take just a couple of questions. And I'll remind everybody that we have friends joining us virtually this evening, so I'll ask you to wait until I call on you and hand you the microphone before asking your questions. But I think that gives us time for one more.
One more? You have a koach for one more?
We can't skip the Islam and Mideast collection.
We can't skip the Islam Middle East one. And so at the National Library, we have 2,500 Islamic manuscripts. And as someone who has 3 degrees in Islamic and Jewish studies, I particularly like this one. And we're looking at Joseph from the Bible, and Zuleika, who is the end of the story. So let's start from the beginning. It turns out that Joseph, like several other figures that we are familiar with in the Bible, appear in the Quran. Now, what's different about these figures in the Quran as opposed to the Bible is that the Quran is a text that's not interested in history per se. It isn't like from Genesis, the creation of the world, until the end of Dvarim, where the Jews or the Bnei Israel are about to go into the land of Canaan, right? The Quran uses stories the way Yeshayahu will, in the sense of a parable to tell a moral or theological lesson. That is true for everyone except Joseph. Joseph is the exception in the Quran. It's the only narrative that is coherent and goes from beginning to end in one telling. Everybody else is kind of scattered here and there. Chapter 12 is called Surat Yusuf, the chapter of Joseph, and it tells a story that's pretty similar to the story we know in the Bible, with a few interesting twists. One of the twists is that the wife of Potiphar, in the Quran is called El Aziz, she gets an upgrade. She gets a few more scenes. Why? Because the Quran is primarily interested in the theological ideas around sin and reward and punishment and forgiveness. And she is a fertile character for sin and forgiveness. And she actually gets a scene later on where she's brought before the Pharaoh, and he chastises her for what she did to the Saint Joseph, and she apologizes, she confesses, and she is redeemed. Okay? She gets an extra scene. Now, the Quran interpreters pick this up and they really run with it, and they give her more and more scenes. And in particular, as these traditions move from the Arabic context to the Persian context, the Persian Muslim writers, in particular these mystical poets, they transform this story into a love story. And she gets a name, and her name is Zuleika. And Zuleika becomes the hero of the story. She actually get a whole backstory. She becomes a North African princess who dreams of this unbelievably beautiful man. And it's because of that that she goes to Egypt, because the dream tells her that this beloved is in Egypt. But she mistakenly agrees to marry Potiphar or Al-Aziz, and she arrives in Egypt terribly disappointed, crushed in fact, until Joseph shows up on the slave auction. And then suddenly she understands, she hurries to convince him to buy Joseph, and then she pursues him. But in this story, the sympathy is with Zuleika. She can't help herself. And then these stories kind of split. Sometimes they end up together, sometimes they don't, and she dies from despair. Now, I'll show you a few. We're looking at the version of what is considered to be the last of the great medieval Persian Muslim poets. His name was Nuruddin Jami. He died in 1492. It's always easy to remember that. And this is an Indian 18th century manuscript with many, many illustrations. And so here we have Joseph sitting with his father, Jacob, and his brothers, right? Looks familiar. Notice that Joseph has a halo, which is a sign that he's a prophet. Here we have him being pulled out of the bowl, the pit. We even have the camels, the Ishmaelites. We have the whole scene, right? So far, that sounds familiar. And then we get to something interesting, because now the Quran follows actually a text that's in the Midrash Rabbah, about Joseph. The Midrash also adds extra scenes, because this is very juicy narrative. What happens? So the wife of Potiphar is so besotted that her girlfriends make fun of her. And she says, "Oh, really? Okay." And she invites them all over. It's kind of a tea party. In the Midrash, she hands out etrogim. In the Islamic version, she hands out clementines, and paring knives. And then she calls in Joseph. And in the Midrash and in the Quran, it says the women were so infatuated that they cut their hands instead of the citrus fruit. And so that's this scene. If you would get real close, you'd be able to see bloody hands. Now, what's interesting about this text is, as I said, it becomes a love story. Now, these are Persian mystical poets, and this whole story is actually a metaphor. Zuleika is the mystic, infatuated with the divine, trying to have a union with the divine. Joseph, the halo, he represents the divine. Sometimes there's a union with the divine, and sometimes there's just an endless attempt. And so here we have, through this manuscript, right? I took you through such a journey, from the Bible to the Quran, from Arabic to Persian, all the way to India, right? Picking up these incredible stories. And so hopefully you've seen, just by a few different treasures from our collections, how each one of these has its own journey, how it ends up in Jerusalem, digitized to be available for you. I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
So our first question comes from the community online, and they're asking about your relationship with the Best Ariella Public Library in Tel Aviv. That also
Beit
is
Ariella.
Beit Ariella. It was an autocorrect. Beit Ariella in Tel Aviv, with their collections, and in particular their special collections.
So we do a lot of collaborative work with Beit Ariella. It's a wonderful public library in Tel Aviv, and it's also the site of a number of important archives. In particular, we have a project that's called the Israel Archives Network, and that is an attempt to gather all the archives in Israel to have one location where you can learn about all the different archives, and slowly we're digitizing hundreds of archives. And so we do a lot of work with Beit Ariella in that area.
Yeah, I was wondering, how do you separate out museum from library, and is there an overlap, and do you compete? And the other question, you didn't mention the Alexandria Geniza, and you didn't mention that Alexandria had the greatest library of its time. And isn't this the great repository? And just one third brief note with Hannah, the Jewish Brigade fought in northern Italy, so I don't know how she would be parachuting into Yugoslavia unless she was working with some other organization.
Okay, help me out here because I'm going to try to remember the questions. The first question is a fabulous one about what's the line between museums and libraries. And yes, there is an overlap. And it comes back to this paradigm I mentioned about text versus object, or almost symbol versus object. And that is, we are interested in collecting material for their content. We appreciate their beauty, but we're primarily interested in the content. A museum is interested in the text and the aesthetic, but there's a kind of privileging of the visual side over the content side. And so you will have a situation where the Israel Museum will have manuscripts, but they choose the manuscripts according primarily for their aesthetic value, whereas we choose manuscripts primarily for their content research value. Okay? We do a lot of work with museums. We lend items to museums all over the world. The Getty is just asked for something a few days ago before I got on a plane. And so we work with museums. We work with all kinds of cultural heritage institutions, because in the end of the day, you don't really care where something is, right? Today, people just want access. And that's our job. Our work is to make sure everything is documented, preserved, and accessible. That's question number one. Question number two,
The
Alexandria.
Library.
I only have an hour. If we had 12 hours together, I have a lot of things to tell you. And that is, the Alexandria Library, of course, was this extraordinary ancient repository of scrolls. They had crazy collections methods, and that anytime a ship would come into Alexandria, they would commandeer the ship, raid it, take all the manuscripts, copy them, keep the original, and return the copy. Okay? We don't use that. It's a little bit of piracy. We don't do that today. But of course, that's the paradigm. And what's interesting about it is that Alexandria lives on as the myth much further than the actual library. In terms of the Cairo Geniza, we have at the National Library several hundred fragments, but more importantly, we now house the digital repository of all Cairo Geniza fragments. It's one of our flagship digital projects, which I didn't have a chance to talk to you about, so next lecture. But we have a project called Ketiv, which is a digital library of all Hebrew letter manuscripts around the world. It's a project that started in the 1950s, actually by the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. And the idea is part of his ingathering in the exiles. And we work with over 1,200 institutions around the world. The Friedberg Geniza project has come over to the library, and it's both the material and a very cool array of technological tools, which again, I'd love to talk to you about in another lecture. And the final piece of that is the Jewish Brigade, under the auspices of the British, were not just in Italy. They sent 44 paratroopers into Yugoslavia. 2 were captured and the rest came back.
Our final question comes from online, and then we are out of time, but perhaps you'll stick around in
happy to
case we
stay.
want to ask
Sure.
you some more. The final question is, how badly do you want the Codex Sassoon? Will you be bidding?
One, we would very much like the Codex Sassoon, so if there's anyone out there who would like to bid for us and donate to the National Library, we would be most obliged. We will not be bidding. But we are working actively with other institutions, both in Israel and around the world, to try as much as possible to make sure that a public institution does end up being the home. Because the number one concern is that this goes into the vault of a private collector and doesn't come out. Because in the case of Jackie Safra, for the first X years, he was not sharing of this, but 4 years ago, to his credit, he did bring in a wonderful photographer, and we do have digital copies online accessible.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank
Thank
you
you
for
very
being here
much.
and sharing these treasures with us.